In my 40 years as a corporate risk actuary, I evaluated worst-case scenarios for a living. I could look at a mid-sized company's supply chain and tell you exactly which invisible fracture would cause a multi-million-dollar collapse within 3 years. I dealt in probabilities, mortality tables, and catastrophic liabilities. I built my career and my $8 million estate by removing emotion from the equation and trusting the data. But the greatest blind spot a man can have is his own blood. You never calculate the risk of your biological children viewing your existence as a depreciating asset. It started in the 3rd week of January. My L4 and L5 vertebrae had degraded to the point where the nerve compression was paralyzing my right leg. The spinal fusion surgery was supposed to be routine, but at 71, routine is a statistical lie surgeons tell you to keep your blood pressure down. The procedure took 6 hours. When I finally drifted up from the heavy, suffocating ocean of anesthesia, my mind was entirely wrapped in the thick fog of dilaudid and heavy muscle relaxers. I couldn't move my torso. I was strapped into a rigid thoracic brace, pinned to a hospital bed, and floating in a chemically induced detachment from reality. That was exactly the variable Marcus had been waiting for. Marcus, my eldest at 42, has always possessed the dangerous kind of charisma that allows him to fail upward. He works in commercial real estate, drives a leased German car he can barely afford to fuel, and wears suits that scream of desperate ambition. When I opened my eyes in the recovery room, he was standing at the foot of my bed, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light. Flanking him were my other 2 biological children. Chloe, 38, a lifestyle influencer currently bleeding through her soon-to-be ex-husband's alimony, was busy inspecting her acrylic nails. David, 36, stood slightly behind them, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, avoiding my gaze entirely. David was always the passive follower. He never threw the stone, but he was always first in line to pick up the broken glass. "Hey, Dad. Easy now," Marcus said, his voice dripping with an unnatural, practiced warmth. He stepped forward, a sleek leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "The surgeon said everything went perfectly. You just need to rest." "Julian?" I croaked, my throat feeling like cracked parchment. "Where is Julian?" "Julian is my stepson, Sarah's boy. I helped raise him from the time he was 12, though I always kept a careful, measured distance to avoid triggering Marcus and Chloe's relentless jealousy. Julian was 34 now, a quiet, brilliant financial software developer who lived out of a modest apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda. He was the only one who had attended all my pre-op appointments. "Julian's at work, Dad," Chloe chimed in, not looking up from her phone. "We told him we'd handle the hospital shift today. He knows you're resting." "Right," Marcus said, sliding a thick stack of stapled papers onto my tray table. He produced a silver pen from his breast pocket. "Listen, while you're heavily medicated, the hospital administration is breathing down our necks about the billing structure and your upcoming transfer to Oakwood Premium Rehab. They need a signature to authorize the financial routing." Oakwood was the state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility we had chosen weeks ago. It had private suites, hydrotherapy, and a 1-to-1 nursing ratio. "My attorney, Eleanor," I mumbled, trying to blink away the double vision. "Eleanor is out of town until Thursday," Marcus lied without missing a beat. "Dad, it's just the temporary medical and financial power of attorney, the exact one we discussed last month. It just lets me handle the Oakwood deposits and keep your utility bills paid while you're flat on your back for the next month. Standard procedure." In a normal state of mind, I would have flagged the urgency. I would have noticed the slight tremble in David's jaw or the way Chloe suddenly stopped typing on her phone to watch me. But my spine was screaming. The narcotics were dragging me under, and these were my children. The children I had provided for, paid tuitions for, and bailed out of debt time and time again. I took the pen with a shaking hand. I signed the documents. "Thanks, Dad," Marcus said, his voice instantly losing its warmth. He pulled the papers away with the quick, efficient motion of a magician completing a trick. "We'll take it from here." I fell back asleep, assuming my next awakening would be in the crisp, sunlit sheets of an Oakwood rehab suite. Instead, I woke up to the smell of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. The mattress beneath me was paper-thin, sagging heavily in the middle. The rhythmic beeping of modern hospital monitors was gone, replaced by the distant echoing sound of someone moaning in a hallway. I blinked, my vision slowly coming into focus. The walls were painted a sickly institutional green. The wallpaper near the ceiling was peeling, curling down like dead leaves. A rusted radiator hissed violently beneath a small barred window that looked out over a cracked asphalt parking lot. "Where?" I whispered, trying to push myself up. A sharp, blinding pain shot through my fused spine, dropping me instantly back onto the flat pillow. The door pushed open. Marcus walked in, followed by Chloe and David. They looked entirely out of place in the grim, shadowed room. Chloe immediately pinched her nose. "God, it smells like ammonia and death in here," she muttered, stepping carefully as if the linoleum might infect her shoes. "Marcus," I managed to say, my voice trembling with a mixture of pain and rising panic, "this isn't Oakwood." "Oakwood had a wait list, Dad," Marcus said casually, pulling a plastic chair away from the wall. He didn't sit down, he just leaned on the back of it. "Anyway, Shady Pines is perfectly adequate. It's state certified." Shady Pines. It was a state minimum facility on the edge of the county, notorious for understaffing and Medicaid overflows. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. "I need my phone," I said, the actuary in my brain finally piercing through the medical fog. The variables were aligning into a horrifying equation. "David, get my phone from my overnight bag." David flinched, looking at Marcus. Marcus reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone, along with my Apple Watch. "Actually, Dad, the administration here warned us about theft," Marcus said, tossing the devices lightly in his palm. "Patients in your condition tend to lose things, or get confused and make accidental calls. We're going to hold on to these for safekeeping." "Give me the phone, Marcus. That is my property. I need to call Eleanor." I tried to project authority, but lying flat on my back, immobilized by a rigid brace, my voice lacked its usual weight. "Eleanor doesn't work for you right now, Dad. I do." Marcus smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just locked the vault from the inside. "You signed a very broad, very legally binding medical and financial power of attorney. You are temporarily incapacitated. And, as your primary agent, I've determined that spending $20,000 a month on luxury rehab isn't a responsible use of the family trust." "The trust," I breathed. My life's work, $8 million, sitting in liquid and semi-liquid assets, waiting to be converted into a legacy after my death. "I have a business to launch," Marcus said, his eyes darkening. "Chloe has a divorce settlement to navigate. And you have plenty of time to rest. Don't worry, the state minimum covers the bed." "You can't do this," I said, my chest tightening as the sheer scale of the betrayal washed over me. "I will revoke the POA. I will call the police." "With what phone?" Chloe sneered, dropping her influencer persona for a moment of pure, venomous entitlement. "You're in a locked ward, Dad. They think you have dementia. We made sure to put it in your intake chart. If you start screaming about your millions, they're just going to up your sedatives." Marcus stepped forward, placing his hands on the armrests of a wheelchair sitting near my bed. It was a heavy, rusted manual hospital chair from the 1990s. The chrome was peeling. There were no leg rests. He kicked the brake with his expensive Italian shoe, unlocking it, and pushed it roughly against the side of my bed. "Enjoy the state-funded Jell-O, old man," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat whisper. "You're done managing things." He turned on his heel and walked out. Chloe followed without looking back. David lingered for a split second, his eyes meeting mine. I saw the guilt there, shallow and useless. Then he turned and hurried after them. The heavy door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a heavy metallic thud. I lay there for a long time, listening to the hiss of the radiator. Finally, ignoring the searing agony in my lower back, I managed to reach a trembling arm over the side of the bed. My fingers brushed the cold, rusted metal wheel of the manual chair they had left for me. Even if I could miraculously transfer myself into it, I couldn't propel it. The thoracic brace prevented me from twisting my torso to push the wheels. I was physically trapped, financially hijacked, and digitally erased. I found the plastic call button clipped to my bedsheet and pressed it. A small red light blinked on the wall. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. No one came. I stared up at the peeling green wallpaper, the cold reality settling over me like a burial shroud. I had spent my entire life calculating risks, protecting my assets, and shielding my children from the consequences of their own failures. I had thought my wealth was a shield. Instead, it was the very thing that had painted a target on my back. But as the initial panic subsided, the actuary in me slowly began to wake up. Marcus had calculated his move based on one massive, arrogant assumption. He believed that because I was silent, I was defeated. He believed the ledger was closed. He had forgotten about the hidden variable. He had forgotten about Julian. An actuary measures time not in minutes or days, but in intervals of compounding risk. Left unchecked, a minor structural vulnerability will inevitably trigger a catastrophic failure. I spent the next 21 days watching my own structural collapse in real time. 504 hours in room 114 of Shady Pines. The physical deterioration was the fastest. My L4 and L5 fusion required movement to heal properly, but I was immobilized. The heavy, rusted manual wheelchair Marcus had mockingly left beside my bed remained exactly where he parked it. With my torso locked inside the rigid thoracic brace, I couldn't lean over to unlock the brake, let alone grip the chrome handrims. My right leg, still suffering from preoperative nerve compression, began to atrophy. Then came the psychological erosion. Marcus had done his groundwork perfectly. He had informed the facility administrator that I was suffering from early-stage vascular dementia, prone to delusions of grandeur and financial paranoia. The underpaid, overworked nursing staff treated me accordingly. When I buzzed to demand a phone to call my attorney, a weary orderly would just pat my shoulder, say, "Sure thing, Mr. Pendleton, we'll get right on that," and hand me a cup of lukewarm state-funded Jell-O. By the third week of February, the silence became heavier than the spinal brace. I had spent 40 years building an $8 million fortress, assuming it would insulate me from the indignities of aging. Instead, my wealth had incentivized my biological children to bury me alive. I spent hours staring at the water stains on the peeling ceiling, calculating the brutal math of my own parenting. I had funded Marcus's failed business ventures. I had paid for Chloe's lavish wedding to a man I knew would leave her. I had shielded David from the consequences of every bad decision he ever made. I had categorized it as providing. They had categorized it as weakness. The only variable keeping me from completely surrendering to the dilaudid drip was Julian. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The freezing rain was lashing against the small barred window of my room. I was lying flat, listening to the rhythmic squeak of a medication cart rolling down the hallway when the latch on my door clicked shut. I didn't turn my head. I expected the evening nurse coming to check my vitals. "The front desk staff is grossly incompetent," a quiet, familiar voice said. It took me exactly 4 seconds to bypass the visitor log. I gasped, a sharp spike of pain radiating down my spine as I tried to twist my neck. Julian stood at the foot of my bed. He was 34, but he looked older in the harsh fluorescent light. He was soaking wet, his faded olive-green canvas jacket dripping onto the cracked linoleum floor. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit like Marcus. He wore dark jeans and a plain gray sweater, a worn canvas messenger bag slung over his shoulder. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes scanning the grim reality of the room, the sagging mattress, the peeling wallpaper, the rusted wheelchair. He didn't dramatically gasp. He didn't ask how this happened. Julian was a database architect. He didn't waste time on the emotional reaction when the system was already failing. He just moved. He stepped to the side of my bed, reached into his damp jacket, and placed a sleek, matte black smartphone directly onto my chest. "Prepaid. Untraceable," Julian said, his voice low and steady. I disabled the GPS and routed the network through a proxy server I set up in my apartment. The numbers for Eleanor, myself, and an emergency private medical transport are pre-programmed. "Julian," I croaked, my throat tight. "How did you—" "Marcus told me you were at Oakwood Premium," Julian said, pulling a folding metal chair to the side of my bed. "He said you were in a strictly restricted Phase 1 recovery protocol. No visitors, no calls. For the first 2 weeks, I bought it. It made clinical sense." Julian unzipped his messenger bag, pulling out a heavy, specialized laptop. "But on day 15, I drove to Oakwood myself. I sat in the parking lot and watched the visitor logs. Marcus never showed up. Chloe never showed up. So I went home and started pulling data. I watched my stepson, the boy I had kept at arm's length for 2 decades to keep the peace with my biological children. I had paid for his college, sure, but I had never brought him into the family business. I had never let him review the estate. I had actively sidelined him to protect Marcus's fragile ego. "How did you find this place?" I asked. "Marcus is an idiot," Julian said flatly, his fingers flying across his keyboard as the laptop booted up. "He changed the passwords to your primary emails, but he forgot that I built your home network router 5 years ago. I still had administrative access to the traffic logs. I pulled his browsing history. He spent an hour on a Tuesday searching for state minimum Medicaid facilities and involuntary POA placement. Then I pulled the county Easy Pass records. His license plate pinged a toll booth 3 miles from here on the day of your surgery." He looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no pity in his gaze, only absolute, unwavering loyalty. "I rented a room at the Motel 6 down the highway," Julian continued, his tone shifting to pure logistics. "It's paid up through May. I brought in a private physical therapist. His name is Thomas. He's fully licensed, but he's going to sign in as your nephew during visiting hours starting tomorrow. He's bringing a portable TENS unit for the nerve damage." "Julian," I interrupted, my actuary brain finally catching up. "A private PT, a motel for 3 months. That's out of pocket. That's thousands of dollars. You don't have that kind of liquidity." Julian paused. He looked down at the keyboard. "I liquidated my tech stock options. It cleared yesterday." The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier than the brace on my chest. Julian lived in a walk-up apartment. He drove a 10-year-old Honda. Those stock options were his entire safety net, his down payment for a future house. And he had burned them to the ground without a second thought, just to buy me a fighting chance in a squalid nursing home. "You shouldn't have done that," I whispered, the shame burning hot in my chest. "Julian, the trust. Marcus has the power of attorney. He has everything." "I know," Julian said. He turned the laptop screen toward me. A complex dashboard filled the screen, displaying a web of banking alerts, routing numbers, and transfer histories. "Marcus thought he locked the vault," Julian said, his voice dropping to a surgical calm. "He went to the bank with the POA. He locked you out of the front end, but your primary trust account is still tethered to the legacy corporate risk assessment software we installed for your firm in 2018. It generates automated back-end quarterly audits." Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on the rusted wheels of the manual chair beside my bed. "They stopped looking at the ledger, Arthur," Julian said softly. "But I didn't. We have the data." He tapped a key and a specific line item highlighted in stark red on the screen. "The financial bleeding started 4 days ago," Julian explained, pointing to the screen. "Marcus has been testing the waters. Small purchases first, expensive dinners in Center City, a $6,000 charge at a boutique jeweler, likely Chloe. But this morning, the dam broke." I squinted at the red line on the screen. My heart rate spiked, the monitor beside my bed beeping a rapid warning. "Withdrawal, $150, 000.00. Destination, Pendleton Holdings, LLC. Pendleton Holdings, LLC, I read aloud, my voice shaking with a sudden icy rage. "Registered to Marcus 3 weeks ago," Julian confirmed. "He's using your liquid assets to seed a commercial real estate firm in his own name. He's draining the cash reserves of the $8 million trust completely legally under the guise of asset management via the power of attorney. If he empties the liquid reserves, he'll start leveraging the estate itself," I said, the panic threatening to pull me under again. "He'll take out loans against the house, against the portfolio." "He will," Julian agreed. He didn't offer false comfort. He offered reality. "Right now, legally, you are incapacitated. Every dollar he takes is authorized by your signature. If we try to freeze the accounts today, he will produce the POA, point to your medical chart here that says you have dementia, and tie this up in probate court until you die. So he wins," I said, my head dropping back against the thin pillow. I handed him the weapon. Julian reached over and gently closed the laptop. The glow faded from the room, leaving only the gray light of the rainy afternoon. "No," Julian said. He stood up, towering over the rusted wheelchair Marcus had left to mock me. "He wins if you stay a victim. But you're an actuary, Arthur. You taught me that every action leaves a paper trail. Marcus thinks he's inheriting your money, but what he's actually doing is documenting his own federal wire fraud." Julian pulled his damp jacket tighter around his shoulders. "I'm going to bring Eleanor here tomorrow. We are going to restructure the risk. Get some sleep, Arthur. Tomorrow, you start physical therapy." As Julian walked out of the room, leaving the burner phone resting on my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt since I woke up in this nightmare. The fear was gone. I looked over at the rusted manual wheelchair. Marcus had calculated my expiration date, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the math. He thought blood was a guarantee of loyalty. He was about to learn that loyalty is a choice, and consequences are compounding. In risk management, there is a concept known as the ruin theory. It calculates the exact mathematical point at which an insurer's cash reserves fall below their liabilities, making bankruptcy inevitable. Between late February and the middle of April, I watched my biological children accelerate toward their own absolute ruin. They thought they were building a real estate empire. In reality, they were building a federal indictment. Spring had arrived, though you wouldn't know it inside room 114 at Shady Pines. The only indicator of time passing was the physical ledger of my own body. Thomas, the private physical therapist Julian was paying out of pocket, had been visiting 3 times a week under the guise of being my nephew. He was a former military medic who didn't accept complaining as a valid currency. By the second week of April, the rigid thoracic brace was finally off. The nerve pain down my right leg had reduced from a blinding agony to a manageable, dull ache. I was still largely confined to the bed, but I could sit up unassisted. My mind, free from the heavy narcotics Marcus had relied upon to keep me compliant, was sharper than it had been in a decade, and I was keeping a very detailed ledger. Using the untraceable burner phone Julian had provided, I monitored the back end of the family trust every evening. Marcus had grown sloppy with confidence. After the initial $150,000 withdrawal in February, he had set up a recurring wire of $50,000 on the first of every month to Pendleton Holdings LLC, but he wasn't the only one gorging on the carcass of my legacy. In early April, a $45,000 cashier's check was drawn from the trust to a high-end family law firm in Philadelphia. Chloe was using my retirement to fund the aggressive divorce attorneys going after her ex-husband. A week later, David authorized a $30,000 personal business loan to himself to pay off a mountain of sports gambling debts. They were operating with absolute impunity. They had stopped visiting Shady Pines entirely, relying solely on the facility's automated billing to ensure my bed was paid for. On a Tuesday afternoon in late April, Julian walked into my room carrying his messenger bag and a large, flat cardboard box. "How's the mobility today?" Julian asked, setting the box down by the rusted manual wheelchair that still sat uselessly by my bed. "I stood for 4 minutes yesterday," I said. "Thomas thinks I can attempt the parallel bars in the rehab room by next week." "What's the damage today, Julian?" Julian opened his laptop, but instead of the banking dashboard, he pulled up a video file. "You need to see this," Julian said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "It's vital for Eleanor's case. Chloe posted this to her Instagram account yesterday. She has 60,000 followers." He turned the screen toward me. There was my daughter, sitting in the sunlit kitchen of my own home, the estate Marcus had essentially taken over. Chloe was wearing minimal makeup to simulate exhaustion. She stared mournfully into the camera, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I want to thank everyone for the outpouring of love," Chloe's voice played through the laptop speakers, thick with manufactured grief. "A lot of you have asked why I've been quiet lately. My father, his cognitive decline has been rapid and severe. Vascular dementia is so cruel. Some days, he doesn't even know our names. We had to place him in a specialized memory care facility for his own safety. It's breaking our hearts, but Marcus, David, and I are handling his affairs just the way he would have wanted before his mind slipped away." My chest tightened. The sheer sociopathic audacity of the lie took my breath away. She wasn't just stealing my money. She was stealing my dignity for public sympathy and internet likes. I took screenshots of the post, the timestamp, and the comments, Julian said, quietly closing the laptop. She just handed us the cornerstone of the elder abuse case. If you have severe, unmanageable dementia, as she just publicly claimed, then you lack the capacity to consent to Marcus's business transfers. It proves they are knowingly exploiting a vulnerable adult. It's time, Julian, I said, my voice cold and flat. Bring Eleanor in. She's already here. Julian stepped to the door and opened it. Eleanor Vance walked into room 114. For 20 years, Eleanor had been my corporate attorney. She was usually a terrifying presence in a boardroom, impeccably tailored, armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of contract law, and utterly ruthless. Today, she was wearing a cheap polyester blazer, scuffed sensible shoes, and reading glasses perched on the end of a chain. She had a clip-on ID badge that read, State Medical Auditor. Eleanor looked around the grim, peeling room. She looked at the rusted wheelchair, then at me. Her jaw muscles flexed. Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating frequency. When Julian first called me, I told him he was being paranoid. I told him Marcus was arrogant but not a monster. I was wrong. And for that, I apologize. You couldn't have known, Eleanor. I didn't know. She set a heavy leather briefcase on the rolling tray table. Let's get to work. We have a very narrow window to execute this. She pulled out a thick stack of documents marked with blue tabs. First, Eleanor said, handing me a pen. This is the official revocation of the power of attorney. By signing this in front of me, a licensed notary, you legally terminate Marcus's authority over your medical and financial decisions. I took the pen. And then you file it with the banks? No, Eleanor said, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. If I serve this to the banks today, they freeze the accounts. Marcus finds out immediately. He claims the revocation is invalid because you have dementia. He hires his own lawyers using the money he already stole, and this gets tied up in civil probate court for 3 years. She tapped the document. We are going to register this revocation with the county clerk to make it legally binding as of today, but we are not going to notify Marcus or the bank. I frowned, the actuary in me processing the variables. If we don't notify the bank, he keeps stealing. Exactly, Eleanor said. Right now what Marcus is doing is a civil breach of fiduciary duty. It's theft, but it's hard to prosecute criminally when he holds a signed POA. However, if he continues to transfer money across state lines after the exact date and time, this POA is legally revoked. It's no longer a civil dispute, Arthur. Julian, standing by the door, finished the equation. It becomes federal wire fraud. Every single time he hits transfer on that banking portal from today forward, Eleanor said, he commits a Class C felony. We aren't just going to stop him, Arthur. We are going to let him build his own prison cell. I stared at the paper. I thought of the dilaudid fog. I thought of the broken wheelchair Marcus had kicked toward my bed. I signed the revocation. Good, Eleanor said, slipping it into her briefcase. Now for the estate itself. Even with the POA revoked, the current trust is revocable. It leaves the assets vulnerable to a competency challenge. We are dissolving it today. She slid a massive 50-page document onto the tray. This establishes the Pendleton Irrevocable Trust, Eleanor explained. Once signed, you no longer legally own the $8 million. The trust owns it. It cannot be altered. It cannot be challenged in probate, and Marcus cannot touch it, even if he manages to convince a judge you've lost your mind. Who is the trustee? I asked. You need a trustee who has immediate absolute control over the disbursements and who becomes the sole beneficiary upon your passing, Eleanor said. She looked over at Julian. Julian shook his head immediately, stepping forward. No, Eleanor, we talked about this. I'm just gathering the data, put it in a blind corporate trust. I don't want the money. Julian, I said softly. He stopped. Marcus took my phone, I said, looking at the young man who had liquidated his own modest future to buy me a fighting chance in the dark. Chloe took my dignity on the internet. David took my money for gambling debts. You're the only person who hasn't asked me for a single dime, and you are the only person who showed up. I looked down at the document. I spent my whole life thinking blood was a guarantee. I was a fool. You are my son, Julian. You are the only family I have left. I signed the irrevocable trust, transferring the entirety of my $8 million legacy into Julian's control. Julian stared at the signature. He didn't say thank you. He didn't celebrate. He just swallowed hard, a profound, quiet weight settling over his shoulders, and nodded once. "All right," Eleanor said, briskly packing the documents away to break the emotional weight in the room. "The legal trap is set. Now, we wait for Marcus to hang himself. Julian, let's get the hardware." Julian stepped out into the hallway. A moment later, I heard a low, mechanical hum. He reversed into the room, guiding a machine that looked like it belonged in an aerospace lab rather than a nursing home. It was a customized, high-end electric wheelchair. It had independent suspension, all-terrain tires, a contoured lumbar support seat, and a sleek, matte black joystick control module. "I routed the delivery to the loading dock in the back," Julian said. "The staff here is so underpaid, no one even asked for a manifest. Thomas said your core strength is ready for a seated transfer." I looked at the rusted manual chair Marcus had left me in. Then I looked at the electric chair. With Julian supporting my right side, I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. For the first time in 3 months, my feet touched the floor. Pain flared in my lower back, but it was a structural, healing pain. I gritted my teeth, shifted my weight, and lowered myself into the electric chair. The lumbar support engaged immediately, taking the pressure off my fused spine. I rested my right hand on the joystick. I pushed it gently forward. The chair hummed, moving smoothly and silently across the cracked linoleum. I turned it in a tight, effortless circle. I wasn't just mobile, I was autonomous. Eleanor snapped her briefcase shut. She looked at the financial logs glowing on Julian's laptop, then looked at me sitting tall in the motorized chair. "They aren't just greedy, Arthur," Eleanor said quietly, adjusting her fake auditor badge. "They've built us a perfect prison cell. All we have to do now is wait for them to throw the party, and we'll lock the door." In my profession, the most dangerous moment is not when a structural failure occurs. It is the agonizing, slow-motion second immediately after, when the people responsible realize the failure is absolute, irreversible, and entirely public. For 10 agonizing seconds, the main dining hall of the Pendleton estate was a vacuum of sound. 70 of the county's wealthiest investors and socialites stood frozen, their champagne flutes suspended in midair. The only sound was the low, steady hum of my electric wheelchair as I held my position 10 feet inside the room. Marcus was the first to break. His survival instinct, honed by decades of talking his way out of unearned debts, kicked in. He forced a wide, plastic smile onto his face and practically sprinted down the steps of the dais. "Dad!" Marcus laughed, the sound hollow and desperate. "What an incredible surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, my father. We thought you were far too ill to travel from the memory care wing today. You shouldn't be out of bed." He marched directly toward me, his hands reaching out. He wasn't coming for a hug. His eyes were locked on the matte black joystick on my right armrest. He intended to seize the controls, override my chair, and physically steer me out of the room under the guise of medical concern. He didn't make it. Julian stepped smoothly into his path, planting his feet on the hardwood floor. Marcus, moving fast in his expensive tailored suit, practically slammed into Julian's solid frame. "Move, Julian," Marcus hissed under his breath, his fake smile straining. "You don't belong here." "Don't touch the chair, Marcus," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the immovable weight of a load-bearing pillar. "He isn't going anywhere." "He doesn't know where he is," Marcus snapped, raising his voice for the benefit of the bewildered guests. "He has severe vascular dementia. I am his medical power of attorney. Actually, Marcus, you aren't." Eleanor Vance's voice cut through the room like a steel blade. Eleanor stepped out from behind my left shoulder, opening her heavy leather-bound portfolio. She didn't need a microphone. Decades of dismantling hostile corporate takeovers had given her a voice that commanded immediate total silence. "For those of you who don't know me," Eleanor announced to the crowd, My name is Eleanor Vance. I have been Arthur Pendleton's corporate and estate attorney for 20 years, and I can assure you, my client is entirely lucid. His mind is sharper than it has been in a decade, which is incredibly unfortunate for his biological children. Chloe, who had been kneeling to pick up the shattered pieces of her champagne flute, suddenly stood up, her face pale. David shrank further back into the shadows near the bar. "Eleanor, this is a private family event," Marcus warned, his voice trembling as the panic finally began to pierce his arrogance. "I have a legally binding power of attorney signed in January." "You had a power of attorney," Eleanor corrected, pulling a blue-tabbed document from her portfolio and holding it up. "Arthur legally revoked it on April 22nd, in the presence of a state-certified medical auditor and a notary. It was filed with the county clerk that same afternoon." Marcus blinked, his brain struggling to process the data. "That's impossible. My transfers went through. The bank never froze the accounts." "Because we didn't notify the bank, Marcus," I said. My voice was calm, measured, and perfectly amplified by the acoustics of the room I had built. Marcus stared at me, the blood draining from his face as the trap finally snapped shut around him. "If we had notified the bank," Eleanor explained to the silent captive audience, "this would have remained a messy civil dispute over fiduciary duty. But by allowing you to continue operating under a legally terminated authority, every transaction you made after April 22nd crossed a very specific legal threshold." Julian opened his messenger bag, pulling out a thick bound ledger of printed spreadsheets. He handed it to Eleanor. "Let's review the ledger, shall we?" Eleanor said, flipping open the book. In May, Marcus Pendleton authorized a wire transfer of $100,000 to Pendleton Holdings, LLC. In June, Chloe Pendleton authorized a $75,000 cashier's check to a luxury Tesla dealership. Over the past 8 weeks, David Pendleton initiated 7 separate $10,000 transfers to offshore accounts to cover gambling debts. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Several prominent real estate investors, the very people Marcus was trying to woo tonight, began setting their glasses down on passing trays and quietly stepping toward the exits. $480,000 in total, Eleanor concluded, snapping the ledger shut. Because these funds cross state lines via electronic banking without legal authorization, they are no longer civil matters. You have committed 52 counts of federal wire fraud. "Dad, stop this!" Chloe cried out, stepping forward, the diamond necklace she had bought with my retirement funds catching the light. "You're embarrassing us. We're your family." "You put me in a state minimum Medicaid bed, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You left me in a rusted chair I couldn't push, took my phone, and posted videos on the internet mourning my lost mind while you spent my money. You didn't treat me like family. You treated me like a corpse that was taking too long to cool." Marcus stepped back, his hands shaking. He looked around the room. The crowd was thinning rapidly. His reputation, his business, his entire fabricated life was evaporating in real time. "Dad, please," Marcus whispered, the arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, hollow fear of a man who has run out of credit. "We can fix this. We can put the money back. We can manage this internally." I looked at my eldest son. I felt no anger, only the cold, clean finality of a closed account. "I'm done managing things, Marcus," I said softly, echoing the exact words he had used to condemn me to Shady Pines. So I let Eleanor handle it. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors behind us opened again. 2 men in unassuming, off-the-rack suits walked into the dining hall. They weren't party guests. They bypassed the remaining crowd and walked directly to the dais. "Marcus Pendleton? Chloe Vance? David Pendleton?" the first man asked. David finally emerged from the shadows, looking like he was about to be physically sick. The men handed each of my biological children a thick, sealed manila envelope. "You've been served," the second man said. "Those are criminal summons for elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and notification of an immediate asset freeze by the federal prosecutor's office." Chloe let out a sharp, genuine sob, dropping her envelope onto the floor. "You can't do this," Marcus yelled, his panic turning to rage. "You can't freeze the assets. The trust is still the family's. Even if you put us in jail, when you die, that money goes to probate." "Actually, Marcus, there is no money for you to inherit," Eleanor said, delivering the final, fatal blow. In April, Arthur dissolved his revocable trust. The entire $8 million estate was transferred into the Pendleton Irrevocable Trust. It is untouchable by probate, immune to civil claims, and entirely out of your reach. Eleanor reached into her portfolio one last time. She pulled out 3 crisp, uncirculated $1 bills. She walked over and placed them on the edge of the podium. Under Pennsylvania law, to prevent you from claiming you were accidentally forgotten in the estate planning, Arthur has specifically designated your inheritances. Eleanor said, $1 each. The sole beneficiary and current active trustee of the entire $8 million estate is Julian Hayes. The room was dead silent. All eyes turned to Julian. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply stood beside my chair, a quiet, hyper-competent sentinel who had burned his own life savings just to keep me breathing in the dark. "Let's go home, Arthur," Julian said quietly. I pulled the joystick back, turning the chair smoothly on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back at Marcus, Chloe, or David. The variables had been calculated. The risks had been restructured. And the ledger was permanently closed. It is a quiet Tuesday in late August. The oppressive heat of the summer has finally broken, leaving a crisp, cool breeze blowing across the back terrace of the Pendleton estate. I'm standing by the stone railing, looking out over the wooded property. I am not sitting. The customized electric wheelchair is parked in the corner of the sunroom, silent and unpowered. It remains there as a reminder, but it is no longer a necessity. I am leaning on a polished mahogany cane, but my back is straight, and the nerve pain is entirely gone. The consequences compounded exactly as the math dictated. Marcus is currently under federal indictment, out on bail, but facing a mandatory minimum sentence. Pendleton Holdings LLC was dissolved before it ever signed a single lease. Chloe's Tesla was repossessed in front of her country club, and her divorce attorneys dropped her the moment the asset freeze cleared. David is currently living in a halfway house, hiding from the bookies who realized his family safety net had been incinerated. I hear the sliding glass door open behind me. Julian walks out onto the terrace carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. He hands me one. He is still wearing a plain gray sweater. Gaining control of an $8 million trust hasn't changed him at all. He still drives his 10-year-old Honda, though he did finally let me upgrade the security system on his home network. "Thomas is coming by at 2 for your physical therapy session," Julian says, taking a sip of his coffee. "He says you can probably drop the cane by October." "I think I'll keep the cane," I reply, looking down at the carved mahogany handle. It's good to have a physical reminder to watch my step. We stand in silence for a moment, listening to the wind through the old oak trees. I spent 40 years of my life believing that blood was the only metric that mattered. I believed that if I provided enough, sacrificed enough, and stayed quiet enough, my biological children would eventually love me. But love isn't a passive investment. It is an active choice. "Thank you, Julian," I say softly, "for checking the ledger." Julian looks out over the lawn, a small, genuine smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "Someone had to," he does. He clinks his ceramic mug gently against mine, and we stand together on the porch, not as an actuary and a stepson, but as a father and a son. True family, finally in balance.